Hi, everybody. This is Eric Hines, Curator of Film at Museum of the Moving Image. I want to thank you for joining us to the September 30th Reverse Shot Happy Hour. If you're joining us live, thanks for taking the time. Hopefully this is the end of your workday and you can relax with us for a little bit. If you're watching this broadcast on YouTube, thanks for finding us. We're finding that people are finding us both ways. So either way, we're grateful to have you with us. Wanted to quickly mention a few things regarding the museum. The first is that we've been doing a fundraiser over the course of this month, thanks to a generous patron who put down $10,000, and the idea of there being matching donations from our community. Just wanted to announce that we've exceeded that goal. We've had $13,000 from our community come in over the last month. So I want to thank both our patron and the audience for doing that. We really rely on our community to keep ourselves going. We especially need that during these times when it's very hard to operate an organization like this during the pandemic. And one of the ways that we've been trying to keep ourselves going is to, of course, reach out to our community for some help during the time, but then also to do events like this so we can actually still be with you. We can still actually find our community that we normally would have in our building, but also find you online now. And then also, regardless of when we get back in our building, hopefully very soon, that we can continue this way and that we can expand our audience nationally and internationally. Quite honestly, to acknowledge the fact that that's been a factor for a long time. And one of the main reasons why that's been a factor for a long time in terms of us having a community beyond Queens, New York, is Reverse Shot. And Reverse Shot has been an essential player in terms of Museum of the Moving Image, but also an essential player in film internationally, in film in New York, in terms of criticism, in terms of really just being an essential voice or multiple voices within the umbrella of Reverse Shot to make sense of contemporary film, historical film, and two of its finest writers, I would say, are joining today's talk. And so I'm excited to bring them out. But before we do, let's meet our hosts. One of the editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Michael Koresky, and a longtime critic and filmmaker, Farihah Zaman.
Hey, Eric.
Hi, Eric.
Thank you for that wonderful intro.
Yeah, I actually found myself like nodding along excitedly, and then I remembered that there's no camera. The show had started, but I wasn't part of it yet. But I was like, yes, I support this, and I am letting you know visually. Self.
Well, you're visual now. I'll see you guys in a little bit. I will become invisible for a little bit.
Bye.
Wait your return. Hey, Farihah.
Really cracked the whip on Eric today. Jeez.
I was being very truthful. I always await his appearance. It's always a reminder of all the good things in life. I just realized that I'm holding this Museum of the Moving Image mug, but this is old swag. This is probably very valuable at this point and shows how long I've been involved with the museum in one way or another. This is the old logo, and I have a lot of fondness for it.
As in pre-construction?
Yes.
I was just, while Eric was talking, I was thinking about how it was one of the last, I think the last public venue I had been to before locking down very quickly and very strictly. And like I almost hadn't imagined what it would be like to go back yet. Like I suddenly remembered like that this is a space that I used to be in with some regularity. I feel like it might be emotional to return to theater spaces, especially.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's for a lot of us, because we had a really wonderful event during the First Look Film Festival in March, which happened the week that everything shut down. So the festival had come to an end, which is a very difficult decision I know that Eric had to make, along with Edo Choi, his assistant curator. But we were there that day. And so a lot of people who had come to that event all have told me since then and have written that this was the last thing that they did in a movie theater, which is poignant, I suppose.
Well, and it was the last public venue I went to, but the first public event I went to where we had just stopped touching, and that was obviously a thing we had to get used to and on a much grander scale. But that was the first time that we were like, oh, I guess I have to figure out all these other ways of communicating with you as a human that I care about.
Well, speaking of touching, that's a really good segue because we're being,
Not by accident.
you're very smooth. Yeah, I mean, I think that we've all been thinking a lot about how much touching that we're missing. And this, I don't even necessarily mean that in the way that we'll be talking about today, which is maybe a slightly more sexual, physical feeling, but also just general hugging, shaking hands, all the things that we took for granted. And I know that we're not the first people to say this, but I think that because cinema is so tactile and it's so much about flesh and people touching people, watching movies now, which of course were basically all made before COVID, it's been an interesting experience. There's a lot of yearning. I know that at first it was like, oh, okay, wow, remember that eating at restaurants, but it's gone so much deeper than that. So remember that touching people. And this is that kind of ties into the theme of the day.
Yeah, and I was really glad that that one of our guests proposed this theme because, you know, obviously there's a lot of ways in which our week-to-week discussions are responsive to the reality of how we're living now. But this got very specific in a way that I appreciated. The title is Casual Encounters. Sorry, I was like thinking of categories of Craigslist
I was going to say
that I like to read. Casual Encounters. Yes. Yeah, and even as you were talking, I was thinking about like there's so many stages of what that means. Even if you're looking at just one particular scene, it might last a matter of minutes, but there's like the seconds leading up to a moment of first touch. There's the way that some filmmakers like really are able to convey this like electricity in the air when you near, but haven't quite gotten there. I liked focusing on a specific aspect of touch, as opposed to, you know, a number of other things we've talked about, like being in community, theater gathering, all those kinds of things. This was like, yeah, also remember like your romantic and sexual life of touch.
And no other art form, I believe, gets better at this essential part of the human experience, which is the tactility of life and people touching one another. The camera can get as close or as far as it needs to be. It's actual people on screen touching each other. And I'm really missing that. Also, movies aren't being made much right now. So I wonder what comes next. What happens to the cinema that we have always known when it's so much about how we are with each other in spaces. But anyway, we should start bringing some guests out to talk about this and anything else. And our first guest that we want to introduce, as Eric said, they're both reverse shot contributors, though they do many other things, brilliant critics, dear friends. And the first person we'd like to bring out is Shonni Enelow, who is a professor of English at Fordham University and is also the author of the wonderful book, Method Acting and Its Discontents.
Yeah.
And unmute yourself, Shonni. And then also is the author of the new book, A Discourse on Method, or the co-author, actually. So anyway, welcome. Hi, Shonni.
Thank you. Hi, guys. I'm so happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that the book is still on order and hasn't arrived. So I would have loved to have been prepared and just lavish praise on you and tell you how brilliant it is, but I haven't read it. I'm sure it's brilliant. I'm sure it's
Maybe now, you could like invent some, hyperbole without, you fantasize your fantasized view of my book.
Now we can understand it completely from your perspective, and I have no way of disagreeing with you.
There you have it. Well, the first thing to say is that I co-wrote this book with one of my favorite contemporary artists, David Levine, who's an artist I've been collaborating with in various ways for the last several years around method acting and its various insanities, I guess. And this book came out of our shared obsession with the history of method acting in the 20th century and with its the way that it's imbricated and indexes all these very specific 20th century American pathologies. So the book is, we call it like a paranoid history. It's sort of a conspiracist, like a tongue-in-cheek conspiracist book about method acting as the dark heart of the 20th century. So the first half of the book is an essay that I wrote after actually finishing my first book. That was sort of a way for me to exercise like my demons that came up while writing that first book that I wrote, Method Acting and Its Discontents. And then the second half is an incredible monologue that David wrote for a gallery show that he did. A really wonderful gallery show called Bystanders, which is about method acting and spectatorship and demons.
What are the kinds
and lots
of
of other
demons?
things, robots. And I just thought I would stop there because it's about a lot. It's a wonderful work of art. And actually, for anyone who's local in New York, you might have caught David had a solo show at the Brooklyn Museum a couple years ago. I guess it was 2018. That was all about spectatorship and crowds, and that also had actors performing in the galleries, and was also extraordinary. So this monologue is in many ways reminiscent of that, and it's a great introduction, I think, to ideas about to why method acting is interesting. It's also a great introduction to David's work. So I hope people will pick up the book.
And we see James Dean on the cover.
You do indeed.
So how does that tie in generally, or how does he tie in, and how does discussion of cinematic forms of method acting tie in to the overall?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, that image you see on the cover is a doctored image that David made from this show of sort of, demon seed James Dean. His eyes are blacked out. And the idea being that method acting, which was about sort of excavating the guts of the actor and performing them in sort of these exorcisms of self, that at least that's sort of what it crystallized in its form as it was practiced at the Actors Studio. That gets at something really fundamental about American ideas and confusions about like what it means to have a self, what it means to be a self, and that it's that this sort of pouring out of affect and trauma and experience that the Actors Studio was engaged in practicing, that's actually this very particular kind of 20th century American form that we're still sort of like working through, even though in many ways method acting is something we can see in the rearview mirror, which is why it's become the butt of so many contemporary jokes, and why there's shows like Barry that are all about making fun of it and thinking about it, I think, and as well, and many others. So in my essay, which is sort of a pseudo autobiographical essay, I go to the method to the Actors Studio archives, which are held at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and listen to the tapes of Lee Strasberg berating, cajoling, and lecturing, hectoring actors. And I think, for me, I mean, in that essay, I think about method acting's Jewishness, which is something that I feel close to, and also, personally scandalized by because it's close to me, and also my experience as a student actor in acting school, as well as sort of a relationship that I have to the middle of the 20th century. From growing up in Berkeley, California, where a certain relation to the middle of the 20th century is kind of like the primal scene of consciousness.
Before we move along, sadly, because we should have just a whole hour on method acting. Let's just say now we'll have you back to talk about method acting. I just want to say that there's a chapter in your previous book, Method Acting and Its Discontents, specifically on William Greaves and symbiopsychotaxoplasm. But I love so much that I taught it. I taught a class on queerness in American cinema at the New School, and that was one of the weekly readings. And I just think that you get at something that about that particular film, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. You get at something that no one else really talked about, which is the way that it actually engages with these ideas and these almost like the satirical ideas around method acting, because I find that movie to be hilarious. So thank you for that. Not that we have to get.
Thank you.
I think we should now invite in our next guest, one of our favorites. He's America's film critic. He's Nick Pinkerton. Come out of the dark, Nick. There he is.
Here I come. Here I am.
How you doing?
I'm so well.
Why do I not?
I feel so good.
I like that you've gone for a noir lighting scheme for today.
Yeah, I thought I'd mix it up a little. Everybody's sort of familiar with the 3 posters behind the sofa, but not often enough is this corner of the apartment explored.
Well, and casual encounters happen in the shadows often, so.
Well, that's not on Craigslist anymore.
I know.
It's not.
No, they took it
No
down.
bummer.
Wow.
Misconnections is still worth reading, but it's not quite the same. It's,
No, not
that's like the desire for a casual encounter more than the promise of its reality. Did you say maybe in Grindr?
No, I was just thinking like that sort of, social media sexual encounters have, changed the landscape of online sex ads in a major way, I would say. From no.
Tragic.
I very much missed.
I'm going full Michelin Cabot today. This is like smoking hard liquor. Just totally blurred out. I should give some background. I've been whiling away my afternoon listening to the Cincinnati Reds Atlanta Braves playoff game 1, and the outcome was not satisfactory. So I'm a little doomery right now.
I think
My sincerest apologies.
I think what's going to happen is we're going to stoop to your level of energy.
That's what I hope for. Yes.
We'll all function at that level. Though I would say that the composition that you're giving us is completely sultry and absolutely appropriate for today's conversation.
Yeah.
Couldn't be happier then. Couldn't be happier.
And of course, it was. I will say it was. I know this. It was 13 innings, and after
It was, yeah. Two bases loaded opportunities in extra innings. Not to speak of a Eugenio Suarez outfield shot that could have very possibly sent Joseph Daniel Votto home. But that's neither here nor there. We're here to talk about moving pictures.
sexy pictures.
Well, Shonni, since we started talking about your book, I was curious if its contents were on your mind at all in suggesting the casual encounters theme for this week, or sort of what inspired that as a focal point.
Well, Farihah, I would love to say that it was a beautifully thought out tie-in, but actually it's really not. I mean, I guess there are, surely I could, reach for a casual encounter in the book, but it's really not about casual encounters at all.
There does not have to be. I'm probably asking that because I'm projecting as an obsessive person who's like, everything's one strand of thought, but you don't have to be that way.
Well, that actually, what you just said is in line with the subject of the book, which is conspiracist thinking. But no, actually, because casual encounters I sort of think of as, that's like anti-conspiracist thinking, right? That's like, chance, randomness, which is sort of the opposite of what we were interested in the book. Well, partially it seemed like a good theme for the obvious reason that casual encounters are not happening right now. But also it was because of Nick's, at least of a certain kind, I should say. I should not project, but the kind of city walking. Okay, I'll put it that way. urban street solicitation, I have seen to be lower than normal in New York City. Although, you know, the masked street harassment thing is kind of interesting. It's come back. Anyways, but really it was because of Nick's suggestion of that incredible movie, Simone Barbez or Virtue, which I watched and loved and can't wait to talk about. So that was like the jumping off point, which I'm so glad that we're going to discuss, because I feel very strongly that I should have seen that movie, that if I had seen that movie at age 20, my entire life would be different. Like, that was the movie I should have been watching instead of Breathless, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like that is like the perfect movie for a 20-year-old young woman to watch. I just love it so much.
I was also really struck by it. And I think that, sorry, I didn't want me to interrupt you, Farihah, if you're going to say something, but I was hoping for Nick to give us the kind of introduction to this film and this filmmaker.
Sure, yeah. The film in question, Simone Barbe ou la Vertu, by Marie-Claude Treloux. It's made in the end of 1979, released, I think, in February 1980. And it belongs to this sort of mini movement, a confederation of filmmakers, of whom the sort of figurehead is Paul Vecchiali, who made films under the auspices of Diagonal, who, though at least like more than cult property in France, have very little traction in these United States. This is a bunch of filmmakers who sort of shared personnel, shared a core of actors, et cetera, et cetera. And it's founded in 76. The Treloux movie made 4 years in. I'm sadly, I have to say, I'm not terribly familiar with the latter films, though I've heard a lot of very good things about a 1991 film called Le Jour des Rois. But this is, I believe, the first feature. And it is kind of a triptych movie. The first part takes place in the lobby of a porn theater in Montparnasse, where there are two female ticket takers working. One is Ingrid Bourgoin in the title role, another Martine Simonet. The second part follows the titular Simone Barbe as she goes to this really sort of phantasmagoric, mostly lesbian, mostly queer, but just kind of a wild grab bag of people, nightclub also in the neighborhood. And then in the final third, she's picked up by this sort of horn dog dragueur, played by the co-writer of the film and a Cahiers de Cinema regular contributor, Michel Dallet. And they drive around in this, you know, very circumlocucious drive toward Simone's home. The guy is a croupier who works at a, coming home from working, I believe, at a Swiss casino, who's initially trying to pick up on her, but through this lengthy dialogue, she kind of disarms and unmans him. And yeah, it's such a special movie, and I was so excited to see that it was included in the New York Film Festival retrospectives program. I mean, I'd been made aware of it some years back by a friend and had never heard a single word about it. Again, you know, the entire like Diagonal cadre is, you know, has become very fascinating to me, but never, you know, had a terribly high profile. And yeah, it's an interesting movie for so very many reasons. I mean, it's extremely beautifully shot and really like delineates the spaces that it takes place in wonderfully well. But more than that, it's like this great, because again, it's like shot in 79, released in 80. It's this great kind of hangover of sexual liberation sort of movie where you have license to, go beat your meat in a Montparnasse porn theater. You have license to, go to the various clubs where ostensibly you can find outlet for whatever desires you may have. You can cruise the streets, but everybody in it is just terribly, terribly lonely. It's just such a sad kind of atomized sort of movie, and in some ways slightly inappropriate for the subject matter tonight, because nobody actually does get what they want in it. There's just these like unmoored, longing people bumping off of one another.
I disagree.
Yeah, that would be my
Well, but that's part of what makes it great as a response to that prompt. Is it just it in fact, you've totally highlighted the ways in which the film disarms our immediate response to that description, that subject matter. Like, all I talked about in our introduction was sex. And that's not actually what is contained within the phrasing of casual encounters at all necessarily. And in the film, it's not that type of interaction that's given, that bears the most significance.
Shonni, you were going to give your response about the film.
Oh, well, I just think that final scene, actually, there is this, this moment of, sort of, vulnerable, emotional connection.
Oh, when Delay peels off his stage mustache, it's very, very wonderful. And I mean, that's one of the things that is such a source of pleasure, is throughout the sort of theater of this world is underlined. Not only the fact that, one of the usherettes is an aspiring actress, and there's constant talk of the Comédie Française.
Constant.
But then
from beginning to end.
Yeah, and you move on to the club where you're treated to this, marvelous floor show, which features, not only this sort of Amazonian sword show and cabaret tunes, but there's a woman billed as José, who's from a band apparently called 1205, which I can find no record of the existence of, who does that wild sort of punkette rave up.
Feminist punk. It's like she does a feminist punk song, a queer feminist punk song.
Yeah.
It's endlessly amazing.
Your phrasing, Shonni, of "my whole life would have been different" is too tantalizing to leave unturned.
Well, I just feel like, the way that this movie is thinking about a young woman moving through this urban space, and it's the sort of flanked by others' eroticism, and the way that character, that's such an amazing character and performance. She just sort of barrels through, in her, that whole first act, where she just owns that space. She's taking tickets. She's like, go there, go there, go there. She's directing traffic in the lobby of the porn theater. It took me a while actually to figure out that she was an usher. I was like, what is this? Because it's this incredibly active, you want that, go that way, want that, and so I think so the idea that she's this, actually her own sexuality, we get in the second part. We get a glimpse of it, although she's still kind of, in some ways, a spectator to this relationship that she's having with this woman who works at the club. But I think that the way that she owns, but also is outside of this, sexualized universe, is just really fascinating and wonderful. And I think that it's it strikes me as a film that is thinking so much about women in movies and what it means to be a feminist subject of a movie.
It also, in that way, it so anticipates Betty Gordon's Variety. And
Mm.
the film people on this panel have seen, I'm sure some of you have. I mean, if for the obvious reasons, the milieu is very similar. The fact that it takes the form of this unpredictable night journey where the film could go in any direction, I thought that was like a clear connection to make. It's also just such a beautiful era to be captured on, you know, grotty film from, you know, late 70s, early 80s. Is there anything more beautiful? But it also did remind me, in a way, structurally, of the film that you wanted to talk about today, Shonni, which is Chantal Akerman's Je tu il elle, which is one of my favorite movies. She's one of my favorite directors. I think it's one of her greatest works. And there was just something about that, the pathway that this movie has, and the kind of the glimmer of bisexuality, and just the general queerness, and the sense of a life being structured to the point of, I don't know, structuralist, I guess, in Ackerman's movie. But I was curious of what made you think of Je tu il elle to talk about this, aside from the very famous casual, not so casual encounter that climaxes the film, which we could talk about.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, you know what? I mean, in addition to everything you've just said, and that it's, you know, it's from approximately the same era, and, you know, clearly it's sort of thinking about what a, you know, what a feminist film could be, what a female protagonist could be. I think that I was really interested, and one thing that really interests me about both these films, and Nick already said it, or alluded to it at least, is the way that they are thinking about performance and theater. And, you know, that whole opening act, if you want to call it, of Je tu il elle, you know, could be an endurance performance piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of a performance piece. I mean, it's, you know, body art of that moment is doing very similar things. And I find that really interesting, actually, that these films are you know, thinking about live media in cinema, like are relating in some way to live media. And it actually, you know, maybe I should say this for later, but it struck me because the third movie that you mentioned, Michael, Days, the Simon Lang film, in a very different way, but also approaches another medium, which is still photography, right? So in thinking about these three films, I was really interested in the way that there's something about the subject matter, these kind of aimless protagonists with these kind of in their everyday milieus seem to get filmmakers, or allow filmmakers to think about and approach other media. So that was something that struck me as really interesting in thinking about these two films together.
For those who haven't seen it, Je tu il elle is Ackerman's film from 1974. It was made 1 year before her most famous film, Jeanne Diamant. And, you know, I would say for those who only know her from that film, and I'm sure there are many, this film is a much more, it's funny, I'm going to say it's a more grueling exercise, even though it's about a third of the length, I believe. I find it to be, it's so structured by its characters' routines that it becomes almost maddening. But then as it moves through the film, and I wouldn't want to give everything away about it, it moves into an increasingly sexualized space until it climaxes in this this real but not real encounter between her and her ex-girlfriend.
Well, and thinking about sort of a grueling experience, or whatever, durational cinematic experience that has a kind of release, like the nature of the release is so different in this film than in Jeanne Diamant. It's not like a moment of extremity or violence. It's sort of like just, it moves in this more transcendent direction in terms of like where to share the pent up energy. I don't know if other people do, but I have 2 Nick Pinkertons on my screen now.
I do too.
One moves and one does not. I'm glad we talked about film and photography. But Shonni, I have a funny story about the movie because I had seen it when I was much younger and always sort of like loved and connected to it. I think long before I totally understood my queerness as well. So I watched it again at another time and was having this sort of emotional experience. And the woman I was seeing at the time leaned over and said, maybe they don't have sex the same way in France that they do in America. And in which, of course, she was like very tongue-in-cheek making a joke about the nature of this particular scene, which I am so fascinated by and think about all the time. Like the idea of like, it's a physical action. So it's like theoretically still in the format in which sex occurs. And yet it is not in fact sex. It is like performing the idea of sex, but using your body, like as if it's dance, but more intimate. I don't know. I haven't seen anything quite like it in a film.
Yeah.
And then your point, like how wonderfully well does it complement the movie's other big sex scene, which is Chantal jacking off the truck driver, where everything is just below the belt and you get the entire thing narrated, but you see nothing of it whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I mean, as to how these two things speak to one another, like it's infinitely fucking complicated. I did want to bulldoze in with one fun fact. That is, when Ackerman was in New York City in the early 70s, she was a porn theater ticket taker at the 55th Street Playhouse, and by her own admission, skimmed $4,000 out of the drawer and used that to finance La Chambre and Hotel Monterey. So it all comes around.
It all comes back.
Yeah,
and even before, you know, Nick and Shonni and Michael, you verbalized this sort of connective tissue between all the films we've talked about, including Variety. I was thinking just about the Barbès even, like, or about Simone Barbès even, that like there's something about there's a reason why those characters have a very explicit relationship to not just film, but like a kind of spectacle, that they like choose to be in this space and be that they like work in and around art, and often in a sort of voyeuristic capacity. So like the tension between doing and watching is very present.
Yeah.
I thought about, because this sort of pairing had been proposed on rewatching Simone Barbès, I thought about Golden 80s a lot when watching it. Not in terms of, you know, obviously the stylistic approach, but just the level of detail being employed to sort of describe what behind the counter jobs are like. And not only that, but like the particular, to take an example from Simone Barbès, you know, begins with the Bourgogne character sort of waiting for her co-worker to arrive and being so agitated when she finally does, and it taking, you know, some amount of time for that agitation to finally subside. She's so pissed off at this girl with all of her dumb theatrical ambitions and her bonehead boyfriend, who she, as you can just tell from the way they talk to one another, must be constantly fucking griping about this guy. And then, and you watch, as is so wonderfully tracked in the film, you watch Bourgogne's character kind of bouncing off the walls of this place, and she finally calms down a little bit. She goes across the street to some cafe to get a glass of wine for them both. And after like initially hanging over her coworker's head, threat of being fired, they sort of settle into this well-worn groove. And it's all so familiar, and at the same time, the sort of thing you see so rarely tracked out that well and with that level of attention and articulation. And I mean, it comes down to, and I mean, I know enough about the biography of Trelhu, and I certainly know this is the case for Ackerman. Like these are people who like have worked shit jobs in their life and know what the like rhythms of being at a shitty job are like, and you cannot fake that.
I also wanted to say, oh, sorry, Shonni.
No, just wanted to throw in one of my favorite little mini scenes in there is when she goes and gets a sandwich. She gets like a baguette and gives her coworker half, and they just sit there in the porn theater with like, and they have this little table set up where they have all their shit like that, and that is so perfect, right? When you go to your shit, you know, you've nowhere to put your like backpack or something, and it's like everywhere.
There's like a Coke can that's been there for a couple weeks, and like some Edition Galamon novel that like she uses to like wave some smoke away at some point.
So amazing. It's really true.
Yeah.
And, this question of work and how sex relates to work, and which how our daily lives can be portrayed in the most casual way, just reminds me of Days. I just wanted to bring Simon Liang's film Days back into it. One of the most beautiful things about everything is beautiful about the film. People don't know he's a preeminent Taiwanese director, one of the great filmmakers of all time. His new film Days is his first feature-length narrative, though that's a loose term, since Stray Dogs from 2013. And it's also playing the New York Film Festival. The thing is that it follows these two characters on two separate tracks. One of whom is played by Li Kangsheng, who of course is Tsai's muse, partner, star of every one of his films, one of the most physically adored people that's ever appeared on a movie screen, thanks to Simon Liang's camera work since 1992, after he first discovered him for Rebels of the Neon God. And he's now 51 years old, and he looks 51. He's weathered, he's been through a lot, he's had a lot of illnesses, but he still looks like the most beautiful human being on earth because he's in Simon Liang's film and he shoots him that way. So you follow him as he goes through his daily routines, most of which consists of treatments for this mysterious illness that is based on the actor's actual illness. And so there's an extended sequence of him getting this very painful looking acupuncture where his back is basically, it looks like it's just being set on fire. I don't know how else to describe it. And so he's going through a lot of pain. He's in a neck brace, which is also kind of a recurring thing inside his films. And then at the same time, you have the story of this much younger man, I think the actor is about 30 years younger. And he's an immigrant living in Bangkok. And you follow his routine. His routine mostly consists of just preparing meals. And then you see him kind of working at this outdoor bazaar. And then with no preparation, with no expectation, these two characters come together for this extended sex scene. And I should say it begins as a massage. So there's this amazing release that you get at just this sensation, the touch, the feel, because you know that this body, Li Kangsheng's body, has been through so much. So the fact that the camera just sits there, like Ackerman would do if she had made this movie, the camera just sits there and watches this massage played in real time. And then it slowly, this is about a half-hour sequence, and then it slowly segues into something more intimate and more sexual, and the beauty of sexual release. And it's simply an astonishment, and it's amazing that something so simple hadn't been done before, but I don't think it would have had as much, it would have resonated as much if it hadn't been this particular actor from this particular director. I say all that as preface to say that by the time these two come together and you realize that the second character, the younger man, has been hired to be the masseur for Li Kangsheng, you realize that this is just a job. There's this connection between them, and there's something so achingly beautiful about that connection, and the remainder of the film is about that connection, mostly wordless. But this is work. This is work. And everything about that encounter is absolutely gorgeous. And so many films that are about hired sex workers are so judgmental and so moralizing about that. And this doesn't even remotely do that.
Well, and in that way, I actually feel, again, that it is like the encounter between Chantal and the truck driver, right? Which is amazingly non-judgmental, I think. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's, that scene where he's shaving, right? And she's watching him shave, after they've, yeah. So I mean, it reminded me actually watching Days and the scene after they have sex and they're sitting on the bed with the incredible music box. It reminded me of that. There's this kind of sense of like even within this kind of in this like sexual world where expectations are totally relate to emotion in a totally different way from the ways that we've been taught to think romantically. There are these moments of sort of emotional vulnerability and communion that happen.
And it's a different kind of emotional experience. It's not that a casual encounter is without emotion. It's simply that it is different than those interactions that come with a lot of trappings and history. And so I think that it's treated in film often as like a potentially turning point kind of moment. Michael, I think we should share this point that Devika brought up about Days, which I think is really interesting. Devika Girish, who's also a reverse shot writer, and works at the New York Film Festival, shared this nugget from the New York Film Festival live talk with Simon Ming Liang, that he said the sex scene is unusually tranquil and non-transgressive for his filmography because the transactional element removes the emotional hangups and burdens of the sex. And as a result, they're able to have this completely other kind of emotion that's so palpable. Like that's how you described it, Michael, that it's like a totally transcendent moment compared to everything else we've watched this person experience.
And worth noting that there is a strong element of perversity in a lot of the sex scenes in Tsai's career.
Yeah.
And I think this is somewhat overemphasized when Tsai's being talked about is, so much of the discourse that's piled up around him is about, urban anomie, loneliness, and, the impossibility of connection in the urban landscape of Taipei or wherever he happens to be operating. And that's certainly there. But at one and the same time, to take the example of Goodbye Dragon Inn, a film that I've had occasion to be thinking about a great bit lately. Yes, that's all there, but also there is the possibility, even if it doesn't come to fruition, of these encounters happening, of these, random intersections happening. And as much as Goodbye Dragon Inn is a movie about, set in this sodden Taipei duoplex on the eve of a temporary closing that's probably a permanent closing, where the theater has become basically a cruising spot for, gay men in Taipei. As much as it is about failure to connect, it is also about the fact that this space exists where the possibility of connection exists, hope springing eternal. And I think it's somewhat telling that Tsai, who, to the best of my understanding, has like a very nice setup out in the countryside and leads a, very bucolic and pleasant life there, he's never made a countryside movie. He's constantly drawn back to cities. He's constantly drawn back particularly to Taipei, and constantly drawn back to the potential for random encounters. And I mean, particularly Goodbye Dragon Inn, it's a movie about mourning the popular cinema of what we can broadly call Greater China, as represented by King Hu's Dragon Gate Inn, but it's also about mourning the disappearances of physical spaces in which people could go and possibly, just possibly, encounter somebody who would be, in however slight a way, meaningful to them. And the meaningfulness, I think, is very evident in Days, when, however transactional the sexual service exchange has been, that exchange of the music box is still meaningful. It still leaves a mark on someone. So all of which is to say, like, you know, as much as Psy is often like put up as this like, you know, 90s vintage, you know, Neo Antonioni, there's something I think very different actually going on in the way that he thinks about cities and the way he thinks about shared space.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing at all.
Absolutely.
It's like a meditation on spaces with like kinetic energy. And that, you know, I think sometimes people who don't feel moved by those kinds of spaces, I think fixate on the trappings. They fixate on like, well, is it to find sex or to drink or to, you know, like it's a list of activities when really it's the list that you can't make and the idea of what might happen. That's so appealing and addictive.
And I think you're getting at something, Nick, about Simon Liang, you know, that I've been trying to define for a long time. I had written about, when I was writing this queer column for Film Comment, I had written about how incredibly important Viva l'Amour, his 1994 film, was for me at a younger age, which is of course a complete masterpiece. But I'm always wondering why. I've always wondered why his movies work so well, right? That's one of the things that we do as critics. Why do these things work so well for us in particular? Why does that movie speak to me, but something with a perhaps similar aesthetic might not? And I was thinking a lot about why a lot of films of the Antonioni vintage have never done it for me. I don't mean to say that as any kind of slag on them. I absolutely love Red Desert. I think L'Aventure is an important film. But in a fragile and tender part of my coming of age, I saw Viva l'Amour around the same time that I saw L'Avventura. Why does Viva l'Amour mean a lot more to me? I kind of chalked it up in that column to the queerness of it. I could identify with it. It felt palpable and real and tactile. But I'm wondering if it's something more than that based on what you're saying. It's something about that energy that actually exists under that surface. So it's not nihilism at all.
I mean, a thing that, because I had occasion to write at some length recently about Goodbye Dragon Inn, and, you know, certainly nothing in Days undoes some of the directions in which I was thinking, but have you ever read Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue?
Yeah. Yes.
Like, 100% kind of unlocked the movie for me, and it's a movie I've
Yeah, that's great.
loved for more or less my entire adult life. But to your point, Michael, like, always had some trouble articulating, like, what is Cy doing that's a little different? What is he, you know, what is he other than an Antonioni 2.0? And I mean, this is a sort of requiem for Samuel Delaney, who's a Black science fiction writer of, you know, some great import, wrote this sort of memoir at the period of Giulianiization. It's a diptych book. First part is a sort of personal recollection. The second part is a sort of sociological essay where he's talking about like what practically like the Times Square porn theaters were. And for a gay man of like Delaney's generation, it was a place to, you know, go meet men that, you know, one may or may not have like continuing relationships with. But above all else, it was this space in which, and this is really the point that Delaney underlines, a space in which like wild interclass encounters could happen all the time. And it's written in the late 90s, so this is not addressed directly, but you think about it in terms of like, how do people like find partners outside of their like social group now? You know, via like various apps that are going to like put you on to people who are basically in your like social circle whatsoever. And Delaney is writing this, you know, wonderful melic ode to the, you know, existence of a world where these absolutely wild interclass, interrace, interpolitical, whatever couplings can happen. Yeah. And that I think is like very relevant to what's going on in Goodbye Dragon Inn, and very relevant to like what's going on in Days, and very different, I think, from the way, again, not to take anything away from all-time towering genius Michelangelo Antonioni, but very different from the way that Antonioni thinks about modernity and thinks about cities.
Right. Right. I mean, I think, and there does seem to me, I mean, and I think that's a beautiful articulation of size films. There does seem to me to be a real difference between that, I would call it like utopian, right, longing in those films, right, which and you know that is so much in Delaney, right, the sense that there's a possibility, there's potential for, you know, a truer, better relation, like a more just, you know, equal world. That I actually don't like. That utopian energy does not seem to me to be in Simone Barbès or really Je tu il elle in the same way. And that, so I'm just thinking, and I don't know if I have like a coherent point there, but I think there's a different kind of relationship to what's understood to be and accepted as a world that is, you know, not necessarily fallen, but not, but other than the ideal. So I guess I wonder if it's that in, you know, if for Antonioni, right, the world, you know, modernity is fallen, and then for Sy, it's like, but there's utopian possibility. You know, for Treilloux and Ackerman, I think there's a kind of there's a way that like potential is sort of seeping into the cracks of the everyday, but it's not going to happen in a sort of epiphantic moment of connection, even though there you know, there are moments of connection in these films.
I mean, the thing that really struck me on going back to Je tu il elle is, and I sort of cherry picked some writing about the movie, and a lot of it sort of concentrates on the idea of the truck driver as just, you know, being this absolute like cavemanish lout, and their scenes together are always fascinatingly framed because, I mean, in the truck cab, you generally got, when he's just sort of running his mouth, you've got Ackerman in this sort of slightly out of focus foreground shot where you can just see her in like, you know, 3/4 profile, but she's cracking, she's like grin the entire, like, you cannot situate that as a scene where, like, you know, some loudmouth is like popping off and merely like, you know, oppressing the eardrums of this poor woman who's like had to share his company. She's really fucking like having a ball with it. And I thought so much of the Marguerite Duras movies, Natalie Granger and Le Camion, especially for kind of obvious reasons, and the way that like Duras like used a young Depardieu in those films, like there some of the, and I think this goes for Je tu il elle, like there's some of the purest like objectifications of like roughneck blue collar dumbasses that you'll ever find 70s like.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, right. So, you know, and obviously that's a big part of what's going on in that scene, but it's, you know, it's not all of what's in the frame, to your point, right? And there's the, you know, his, you know, there's an authenticity to that monologue as, you know, repellent in some ways as it is, that he gives, that can't be totally written off.
But I mean, moreover, that entire passage is like, nothing about it is framed as like, you know, what a shit situation I've got myself into. Like, right. You know, she comes off as like, oh, I've really captured myself a rare bird here, and I'm going to enjoy his world for as long as I can.
Right. Speaking of blue collar roughnecks, look who's rejoined us. Eric. I'm looking for those pearls. I'm looking for those.
Is that your best ever greeting, Eric?
Absolutely. I don't know what I did to deserve that, but yeah. Well, I mean, not that I want to bring another film into the mix that we have time to get into, but just a few days ago, I've been sort of quietly trying to accrue a respectable amount of viewings of Maurice Pialat films, which I've loved everything I've ever seen, but I can't binge on them. I need a little space in between, and I've been taking advantage of the offerings on the Criterion channel. But I saw Lulu for the first time, which I'd been sort of craving, and that film means a lot to you, Nick. But I think it's a film that belongs in this conversation as well. You know, the sort of the kind of boorishness of Gerard Depardieu's character, who also is just simply unquestionably the sexiest thing on screen, and nobody can quite understand or explain why, but it's just simply a fact. And the fact that everything kind of moves around it, no matter who they are or what position they have in life, the sex appeal just kind of wins out at all times, and doesn't ever really get counteracted. There's no comeuppance for that whatsoever, really. I mean, and that just is sort of, I don't know. I just I've been thinking about it the last couple of days, but I think it sort of belongs in this conversation.
Well, I mean, Lulu, you can think about like the truck driver interlude in Je tu il elle, but if instead of going to her girlfriend or ex-girlfriend's place, Chantal Ackerman's like, this guy's my boyfriend now. I'm going to integrate myself into his social world. And I mean, to say that there's no comeuppance, like communal dinner scene in Lulu is, I mean, nothing if it not exactly that. It's, right. The Huppert character saying, this absolute fucking bozo fucks the shit out of me, breaks the bed, absolutely wonderful. You know what? We're just going to go for it. We're going to like transcend all like social boundaries, and this is going to be it from here on. And then that communal dinner scene, you can see that resolve breaking down entirely.
Gosh,
but there's still
the dick is quite extraordinary, but perhaps
that makes it sound
perhaps I need to reconsider some of the decisions I've made.
I mean, on a lighter note, or a much lighter example, has anybody else delighted in watching Starstruck? Or is that what it's called? Yeah, Starstruck. The Australian musical, incredibly beautifully shot. It was added to the Criterion channel, and I'm making my way through their like Australian New Wave series. But there is a casual encounter. It means absolutely nothing. And I could not believe how refreshing it still is to be like, oh yeah, she like had sex with that one guy one time. And again, it's so beautifully shot that I think we've been conditioned to assume that then turns into a romantic dalliance, that like city is behind them. There's some sort of gauzy net. She looks like a young Babs a little bit. And really, it just doesn't matter, because it's not like she wanted to have sex that night. It was a fun time. It is part of understanding her character, but ultimately that's just, it's not a linchpin. And I think that also is like a function of some way, like feminist views of sex that I remember seeing in films younger and still being like reminded of their importance by.
Well, I feel like we haven't even mentioned Claire Denis' Friday Night, which in some ways is one of the great films of this genre. Again, talk about
the casual encounters genre.
Yeah, just talk about celebrating the casual encounter and everything.
We had talked about it in preparation for this. It was one of the films that we talked about, but didn't actually come up in conversation. And we should also say that the opening song, which might also be the closing song, I'm not sure, was inspired by Claire Denis as well. Yeah. Because of 35 Shots of Rum, one of the most beautiful physical tactile films. It's about the love between a father and daughter, but it is extremely sensual movie and one of the greatest. I know that we're way over and we need to end, but I have one more thing to say, because though we've been talking all about these amazing art films, these French films and Taiwanese films, I was trying to think like what's the most known, or at least what's the most iconic American movie about a casual encounter and the consequences. And of course it was Fatal Attraction, which
Oh.
is the opposite of everything we're talking about. And I would love, so I actually rewatched it because it's available easily to stream. And you know, all of the moralizing, all of the conservatism, everything that's disgusting and terrifying and misogynist about that film is all there. It's also a much more beautifully made film than I remember. And I think that's one of the slickness of it is one of the insidious things about it. But it's really, it's pretty hateful and it's pretty incredible.
Pretty hateful and sexy.
Well, I mean, it's a backlash movie. It's a feminist backlash movie.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like the quintessential feminist backlash.
That's a very nice twist to end on. And yeah, I think today
when the subject of Vendredi Soir, which is a movie that I don't really jive with at all, but when like Denis was brought into the equation, I immediately thought about Trouble Every Day, the truly great casual encounter movie, and recalled who is the first, I believe, the first victim of Beatrice Dahl in Trouble Every Day. A truck driver.
Truck driver cinema.
Truck driver cinema. The truck driver as eager gigolo and perhaps victim to the wiles.
I was going to say we have a very easy toast in casual encounters, but I really want, what did you say? What gigolo, Nick? What was the delightful phrase that you used?
That's many seconds ago. I can't recall.
Oh gosh, I know. I thought I had it. Okay, so casual encounters it is.
Well, just as tradition dictates, but also because the turnout is very, very strong, the not quite casual encounters at home of our dear friends in Reverse Shot who have come back for repeat engagements that are here today. Bedatri Chaudhuri, Chris Wisniewski, James Wham, Jordan Cronk, Justin Stewart, Nathan Kasub, Ryan Swen, and Nicholas Rapold. Thanks for joining us. And thank you everybody else for joining.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here, Shonni and Nick. Come back soon.